Ringo here, and this is my yellow submarine.
I pulled out one of those old fan magazines the other day. Since I'm recalling yesterday, just to see what's changed. Let's open it up here. Okay, page 43. Ringo Starr, right? So far. Real name Richard Starkey. Birth date June the 7th, 1940. Gemini. Well, not quite right. It's July the 7th, 1940, and I'm a Cancer. Color of eyes blue, height 5'8", weight 134 pounds, about the same. Favorite actress Bridget Bardot, wasn't she everybody's? But you know, folks, right now, my beautiful wife, Barbara Bach, is my favorite film actress. Hi, Bob. Okay, enough of that. George was the first to get into Eastern philosophies and music. I remember the day we worked on Norwegian Wood. He brought his new sitar to the studio. Well, John asked him, can you play something on it? No, said George, but I can play Norwegian Wood. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of the group and myself. You've all passed the audition. Let's start off this cruise with a song from Sgt. Pepper, one that our roadie Mal Evans helped to write, probably while he was fixing a hole. Your mother should know, and she should, and Fixing a Hole from Sgt. Pepper. You know the album with all those clues that Paul was supposed to be dead? Well, the Paul is Dead story was started by a DJ in America. And, we were as interested as anyone else, so we pulled out all the albums and looked at all the clues, like the Black Rose and the car on Abbey Road and, this and that, everything they were saying at the time. And if you read it that way, it worked out, you see. A lot of it was worked out really well. So if you put all these clues together, it actually said what someone else had made up. And then we had a terrible problem because, we thought, well, how do we counteract this? Let's do a photo. We couldn't do a photo because they say, no, it's not Paul. It's the clone. You see, the problem we had was that everything we did, everybody read so much into it, you see. If we'd have been that bright, we wouldn't have been playing music. We'd have been on the moon. All the songs were warped in people's minds. Oh, we know it. I had a guy living with me. Well, he lived in the garage, actually, for 2 weeks, and every day he'd come knocking on the front door and saying, I'm the walrus. And I was saying, fine, get back in the garage. And then 2 weeks later, of course, he knocks on the door and he says, well, just give me £250,000. Because I'm the walrus. And I'm saying, well, you can be the walrus and live in the garage, but I'm not giving you no £250,000. So we had to get rid of him. But we'd have all that strangeness going on. People would read all this craziness into it, So we couldn't get out of it, so we just in the end said, well, forget it. But that probably turned into one of the biggest rumors that ever went down. To this day, some people aren't really sure, and neither am I. The continuing story of Bungalow Bill, a song based on a tiger hunter John met during his adventure with the Maharishi in India. Yoko helped out in the chorus. When we recorded the Abbey Road album, it was basically split down the middle. That is, John wanted songs straight with no gimmicks, or as he called them, production tricks. Paul, on the other hand, liked to get in the studio and kind of play around and mix things together. So side one of Abbey Road was a collection of songs the way John wanted them, and side two was a medley of bits of songs put together the way Paul wanted them. Well, that's not strictly true. We mainly did side two the way it was because nobody wanted to bother finishing the song, so we just put all the first verses and choruses together. Well, that was the Sun King medley from Abbey Road and A Day in the Life, with the Sgt. Pepper reprise. The last chord there at the end of Pepper took 3 pianos and 3 people playing them, of course. So that's 3 people, 3 pianos and 6 hands, with our producer George Martin on harmonium. And I was playing piano, just thought I'd get that in. For all of you without stopwatches, the chord lasts just over 42 seconds. We all had to sit very quietly while it rang out. If you listen carefully, you can hear someone's chair squeak right at the end. It wasn't me, folks. Coming up, more from Abbey Road, because. Because of what? Because of you. Believe it or not, if you roll over Beethoven, and you probably will, you'll find a Beatles song from Abbey Road. What do you mean, Ringo? I'm not too sure. Well, if you play the chords from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in reverse, you'll get what John and Yoko got when they did it, the song Because. Everybody thinks that we have all these volumes and vaults full of tapes of stuff we've recorded but never released, which isn't strictly true. They've all come out at sort of bootlegs, and then sometimes they put them out like reality. But there really isn't too much in the can of Beatle material that could be released. There's several takes. In fact, there's thousands of takes of tracks. I don't know if they're keeping all that to this day. But most of them won't have vocals. There's a few tracks that we redid that they're probably keeping. There's no great amount that didn't come out, because we went in there specifically to do, in the old days, a single and an album. Then we ended up like everyone else. We just do an album and you take the single off. After we'd done like the rehearsal of all the tracks, we'd usually work on 10 to 15 that we really wanted, and if one of them didn't come up, we wouldn't use it. And if we were, three-quarters of the way in, maybe someone would write a new song, so we'd do that and cancel one of the old songs. But there's very little finished product that anyone could put out. The Beatle product, the records, EMI have the right to put out any Beatle record that they have whenever they want, and all they have to do is tell us, and we can't stop them. I'd just like to mention this point to any would-be bands. It's very easy to sign the contract when you're all pals, but to try and split the contract is very hard. We've been trying now, not that we're not friends anymore, to split this contract we have together for 12 years. But I'd just like all you bands out there, with all your mates who are signing these contracts, try and do as much as you can without one, because things do change. And that's not only with yourself, that's with managers, agents. Anyone will try and get a piece. And sometimes they deserve it at the beginning. And then if, things get big, maybe they don't deserve it and you have to move on. There's famous stories of acts who are owned by 4 or 5 managers, so they're doing all the work and they're getting nothing out of it because they have to pay so much out. And it's still like that, which surprises me, because my son, Zach, he's playing with the band, but he's been offered a job now with another band, and they wanted to give him a year's contract, so we sat down and talked about it. We'll all be very careful about anything he signs, so he's not stuck for life. That was You Never Give Me Your Money, and You Don't. You Only Give Me Your Funny Paper, and You Do. And Honey Pie from the White Album. A bit of Beatle musical chairs there, as George is playing bass on that cut instead of Paul, who was on piano and, of course, vocals. Well, maybe the Beatles didn't make it to the #1 on Radio Moscow, but our albums certainly sold better than hotcakes on the black market there. Some of the records went for $100 or more. Actually, a deal was worked out with the Soviets, and our albums were released in Mother Russia. The first song that was officially heard all over Russia was Let It Be. Now here's some magic from the movies, a song John wrote for A Hard Day's Night. You didn't see it on the screen because it wound up on the cutting room floor, like most of the good bits. Brian Epstein, our manager, he was already involved with the Beatles when I met him. And the first time I met him, I was watching the band at one of the gigs, and we just said hello, because he knew a lot of the bands and he was always around, so you end up saying hello to people. And then he came up one afternoon to ask me to play a lunchtime session and drove me to the session, so that's how we really met. And then we ended up, he lived in an apartment and George and I had an apartment just below his, so we were always like in each other's apartment, if we had nothing to do. I thought he was a beautiful man and trustworthy. Though he wasn't the greatest businessman, you felt you could trust him. And we only found out later, of course, that he wasn't the greatest businessman. But he did well by us. He was like, I think, one of the last real managers where he did support us in the early days by buying amps and suits and paying us a wage when we weren't actually making enough money to cover his bills. So in the end, he deserved everything he got. And he was always sympathetic to you. If you had problems or anything, you could go and rap it out with Brian. And he liked to gamble. We used to have wonderful times touring America on the plane, because we'd play poker in those days it was like either a 707 where they used to have the lounge in the front, or we'd either hire a plane, and he'd have this madness. We'd all be playing poker as we're flying all over America, and then suddenly Brian would pop up and say, "Let's have a fiesta." And that meant that you could put $1 on the bet and he'd pay like 50 to 1 or something. So if you won that hand, that was okay. And he was a real nice guy. And we missed him when he went. You know, we all got a bit crazy. We didn't know what to do, and in the end we formed Apple. I remember how George Martin used to work with us. He was a big help along the way. On Can't Buy Me Love, for example, he even changed the whole structure of the song. Paul and John had the song start with the verse, you know the part, buy you a diamond ring, my friend, if it'll make you feel all right. Well, George Martin thought it needed some kind of hook to open it up. So he came up with the idea of starting the song with the chorus, the Can't Buy Me Love part, and it worked. Well, strange things happened here on tour. We were in Manila. We arrived in Manila with 20,000 cops, 100,000 people. Big motorcade, motorbikes, wow, wow, yeah, here they come. Fabulous. So we go, we do the show. I'm with John in one room, Paul and George in another. So we ring down for breakfast in the newspapers. Nothing arrives. Hello, this is room 202 again, whatever room we're in. Could we have the newspapers? Because we always like to read the newspapers after we've done a show, see if they liked us. And nothing was coming. This was going on for an hour and all. Suddenly, there's a lot of activity starts happening around, you know. Come on, pack your bags, let's get out. What's happening here? There was a dinner that Madam Marcus had given that we had politely refused because after we played, we didn't particularly want to go to dinner. And we said, you know, thank you very much, but no thanks. But she went ahead with it anyway. And she'd invited all these kids and the heavies of Manila. And she'd got a TV crew there, so we saw the TV, and there was this horrendous TV show of all these kids crying and these empty plates, and the Beatles didn't turn up, you know, after they already knew we weren't coming. She went along with it. I don't know if she didn't want to lose face or what. And so we left Manila with one policeman and still 100,000 people, but this time they were trying to kill us. They were spitting on us and screaming at us and everything, and, you know, no one was helpful at the airport. So we finally got to the plane, besides the sidestep that John and I were hiding with the nuns, because we thought, well, it's a Catholic country, they won't beat us up in front of nuns. And we're talking to these nuns like nothing's happening, and people spitting all over us. So we get on the plane, and they pulled off our road manager and our press guy. We thought, oh, God, here we go. They're pulling us off 2 by 2. We'll never be seen again. But the plane was a BOAC plane. They did get us out, folks. And we went to India and had a fabulous time. And I've never been back to Manila since. Those Let It Be sessions were eventually recorded and filmed at London's Twickenham studios and on the roof at the Apple offices. The director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, wanted us to do the concert part at either an ancient Colosseum somewhere in Tunisia or on a ship out to sea. Would have been good for this show. We settled on the Apple roof. Much better idea. I think there's no place like home. When we shot the end concert scene in A Hard Day's Night, director Dick Lester had 9 cameras going all at once. He had 6 of them covering us from every angle. Besides that, he had 3 more TV cameras in the control room filming us on the monitors. Besides worrying about all 9 cameras, he also had to worry about the 15,000 fans in the audience. Although they had hired some regular actors, you know, like paid actors. Phil Collins was one, incidentally. They had real fans in the audience as well. Fortunately, it all came off without a hitch. From the rehearsal scene in the studio, here's John from A Hard Day's Night and If I Fell. Yes, it's Ringo here again, cruising back to Pepperland. Together, you and I will listen to the music and memories from the days when Strawberry Fields were forever. To start with, a song from the White Album that was inspired by a Back in Britain ad campaign. Paul switched countries around and came up with Back in the USSR. Yes, that was What You're Doing, a song I helped to write, Something from Abbey Road. Before that, both John and George played bass on Back in the USSR. Paul was on lead. This is Ringo's Yellow Submarine, remembering the crazed days of Beatlemania. The first time in New York was fabulous. Thousands of kids. I mean, there's a lead-up story where we got off the plane here in England coming from Sweden, and just by chance, Ed Sullivan was getting off a plane from New York. And we hadn't done anything in America. And he saw there was like 10,000 kids at London Airport. So they got in touch with Brian and they booked us for the 2 TV shows just because he'd seen this crowd. And he booked us for like 6 months later. And in that time, George had a sister living in America, and he went on holiday. And he was going around the local store saying, excuse me, have you got the Beatle record? And the people were looking at him like he was crazy and saying, we never heard of them, and who are you, and what do you want to get out of here? And we were all a bit worried about going over to America. But we did arrive in New York, and we had a #1, and we knew there was some buzz, but we didn't know it was quite so big. And we just boogied all up. Well, in fact, I think we were doing the twist in those days. We twisted the night away, as Chubby Checker said. Hide Your Love Away came out of John's self-proclaimed Bob Dylan period. He'd been listening to a lot of Dylan and started to get influenced by his style of writing. That song was a hit for another Brian Epstein group, the Silky. They were a folk group made up of students from Hull University. I think I was the only Beatle not involved in that version of the song. George played tambourine and John and Paul produced it. Somebody was always suing the Beatles for doing this or doing that. Most of the time they were just nuisance suits and never really amounted to anything. But one time Chuck Berry's publishing company sued John for using a couple of lines from Chuck's You Can't Catch Me in John's song Come Together. Well, they settled the suit when John agreed to record a couple of Chuck Berry's songs, which he did on his own rock and roll album. Here's the song that got him into trouble. All of that Shakespearean stuff on Walrus was a performance of King Lear that John pulled off the air when we recorded the song. John plugged the radio into one of the overdub tracks and recorded whatever happened to be on the BBC at the time. Well, King Lear was on, and John just mixed it in and out of the track wherever he wanted. You know, when the Beatles recorded, we did a song over and over until we got it just the way we wanted. Well, the next song is a mixture of two totally different versions, recorded on different days. Originally, we recorded Strawberry Fields Forever with just the four of us playing. John took that version home for a few days. Then he asked our producer, George Martin, to do an arrangement for strings and horns, and we recorded it again. John liked parts of the new version, but he also liked some of the old one as well. The only problem was they were in totally different keys and different tempos, which would make cutting them together impossible. But not too impossible for good old George Martin. He slowed down the speed of one version, sped up the other, and found to his amazement, and ours, that they were now in the same key, and it worked. Very clever, George. Well, songwriting, sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard. The fastest song I ever wrote was Back Off Boogaloo, and that was because I spent the evening with Mark Bolan from T-Rex, and he used to talk like that, you know, back off this, and it's a boogaloo baby, and that was just how he talked. So I went to bed after he'd left. I was just falling off to sleep, and this song came in my brain. And so I leapt out of bed because, you know, you tend to, I'll remember it in the morning. You never do it. And it's just one of those nice, I'll get out of bed and record it. And I rushed downstairs, and out of like the 5 or 6 tape recorders I've got, not one of them would work. There's no batteries in, and the electric ones were broken, or there was just something wrong with everything. And the craziness about it all, the song was gradually turning into Mac the Knife, which was getting me crazier and crazier. And in the end, I found old batteries, and we managed to get an old battery tape working. And I put the first verse and chorus and the melody down on that. And then George helped me finish it, because I'm really good at, the first verse and chorus, or even the second verse and chorus. But after that, it gets a bit hard for me to finish the song. So we went into the studio, and George helped me finish off the words, and he was producing it. And for all you Beatle freaks in the audience, Lady Madonna was the last Beatles single released on Capitol in the States and Parlophone in England. After Madonna, everything came out on the Apple label. You know, back in the craziest days of Beatlemania, our fan club and even our own homes were flooded with thousands of letters a day. We tried to read and answer as many as we could, but it just got out of hand. We published a lot of the letters in our monthly fan magazine. 2 books even came out in '64, Dear Beatles and Love Letters to the Beatles. And a lot of the letters started out like this. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles. The press made it into a big battle, really, but that wasn't actually going on between the bands themselves. We were all quite friendly. The first time we saw the Stones, we were doing a TV show called Thank Your Lucky Stars, which is really good if you were trying to sell records at that time. It's the biggest sort of pop show in England. And we had a press guy called Andrew Oldham, who also was, in a way, managing the Stones. And we did the show in Birmingham, which is 200 miles from London. And we got in the car after the show and we drove to London, and he said, why don't you come and see this band? And they were playing in some pub. So we went over and we really enjoyed it, and we all said hello. And from then on, we sort of kept saying hello. And in the early days, when we're all getting to know each other, John and Paul had written I Want to Be Your Man, sung by yours truly on one of our first albums. I Want to Be Your Man was more or less written for the Rolling Stones. The Stones invited John and Paul to visit a club where they were playing and asked them to write a song. John and Paul played them an unfinished version of I Want to Be Your Man. Mick and Keith both liked it, so John and Paul went off into a corner and finished the song. Seeing how easy John and Paul wrote I Want to Be Your Man probably inspired Mick and Keith to start writing their own material. You know, John imagined a kind of hurdy-gurdy calliope sound on Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. So George Martin recorded all sorts of steam organ sound effects, took little bits and pieces of different ones and had the engineer put them all together at random, so it would sound all jumbled up, like this. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. That was written during the period when John first started to write from more of his personal side rather than in the third person. Ringo's Yellow Submarine was written and researched by Doug Thompson with Rick Liebert and Ringo Starr, engineered for Startling Studios by Mike O'Donnell and for Watermark by Paul Liebskeim and Stu Jacobs. Production assistant Nancy Conover. Created for the ABC Radio Network by Corinne Baldessano. Conceived by Walter Szabo. The programs were produced and distributed by Watermark ABC Radio Enterprises. Producer Tom Rounds. I'm Ringo Starr saying don't forget to get your daily dose of rock and roll. And once in a while, stop and smell the roses.